Hey, thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Robert Perry. I'm on a bit of a mission to help as many people as possible discover that they're already libertarian. And part of the way I'm doing that is I'm having different people from different perspectives join me. This is Joe Hunter with us tonight. Joe was a Marine, and Joe is now a libertarian. You're the chair of Warren County, right?
Yes, that's correct.
I get a little confused. I was okay with it until we had Brad Barron running, and he's in Warren County. He's active in Warren County, which is next to Barron County. So now every time I bring up the mental map, it's all muddled there. But anyway, yeah, Joe and I were talking last week, and I was observing to him that a lot of my former military friends, particularly Marines, I have several friends who are Marines, and they tend to be libertarian, and some of them know they're libertarian. Some of them are part of libertarian parties, and some of them aren't active, but they're still libertarian and know it. And then some of them just don't even know it. So I got to talking to Joe about that, and I wanted to know why he thought so many former military were attracted to libertarianism. So what'd you come up with, Joe? And am I right? Am I even right?
Well, that's one of the things I noticed as I started taking a more of a leadership role in the party. Is I started to see, and I talked to people, and I would kind of hint at my military experience, and they'd be like, "Oh, I was in the military too," and this happened more often than not. And I started to realize that a lot of the people around me have former military service. And then when I look at, hey, J.S. Coleman, there's a Marine there too.
Yeah, woohoo!
But when I started to look at even like the presidential candidates, let's look at that as a representative sample. So of the presidential candidates that were balloted, we have Jacob Hornberger, Adam Kokesh, Jim Gray, Joe Jorgensen, John Mons, Vermin Supreme. 3 of those were in the military. Jacob Hornberger was Army. Adam Kokesh was Marine Corps. Jim Gray was also U.S. Army. Then there's other notables, of course, Ken Armstrong, Coast Guard, Larry Sharp, Marine Corps. Ron Paul, he was Air Force. Harry Brown was Army. Drew Carey, he's a notable libertarian, and he was Marine Corps. So when you look at it, you see that you have a lot of military, and they're not just sitting on the sidelines of the party, but they're actually taking a leadership role within the party.
Right. So it's definitely there. I didn't just imagine it. So why do you think that is?
Well, of course, anything I say is going to be guided by my experience.
Of course, anecdotally, why do you think that is?
But from what I talk to other former military people, one of the biggest points we all can agree on is we witnessed the various levels of fraud, waste, and abuse. For instance, in my experience, I remember going on the range, once a quarter. And occasionally we would end up with, more rounds or more ammunition than what we needed to train with. They got to the point where we had, so much left over. It wasn't even worth shooting at targets anymore. It got kind of like tiresome. So we would end up, just kind of shooting wherever. It didn't even matter. It wasn't even target practice anymore. But we had to expend the ammunition. And the reason is because there's a use it or lose it policy within the government. This is actually something throughout all government agencies, as far as I know.
So I wouldn't have thought of that in terms of the military, though, with ammo.
Right. Ammo is obviously something that when you need it, you want to have it. But we couldn't just say, hey, we need to have this much, every other quarter or every third quarter.
Right.
You have to have, a quarterly requisition of it.
Right. Now,
that's just one example.
I'm a strong 2A guy in principle, but I'll admit I'm not as familiar with firearms as I should be, but I'm almost positive there's not a best fired by date on those rounds. Is there? I mean,
no. And even if someone tried to call it out back at that time, I'm sure they would say it's familiarity training. We're getting more familiar with the weapon as we're blasting the rounds arbitrarily in whatever direction. No. It turns out at my range we actually had an endangered bird sanctuary behind us. So we had to make sure not to accidentally fire into that direction. That's out in Marine Corps Base, Hawaii, by the way, for anyone who was a Hawaii Marine. Say, look, we got J.S. Coleman's comment there. He's agreeing with what we just had.
Right. He remembers being in Afghanistan and being told while at an Afghan school by an English-speaking teacher that he estimated only 5% of Afghan people had ever heard of 9/11.
Yeah.
That's believable.
Yeah. Hey, Kanyoe. That's another one. That's where I was stationed at as well. Small world. But another thing I saw was human error. Now I'll go ahead and kind of preach on what I did in particular in the military. So when I joined up, I became what was called a 2841, which was a intermediate ground rated repairman. I worked on electronics and circuit cards and things. So I wasn't an infantry marine like some of the people I know. But one of the things that I noticed is that we're young. We come out of high school. A lot of us come out of high school. Some people came in later.
Sure.
But a lot of us, we don't have a ton of experience, and we get very short, quick courses on whatever our occupational specialty is, no matter how advanced it is. And one of the things I recall is when I first came into my job, they gave me a piece of equipment, and I didn't realize at the time, but that piece of equipment had been in that shop for a very long time. And they wanted to see if someone could just push it out. And me being persistent as I am, I spent a good month or so inside of our manual library reading up on this piece of equipment. I eventually ended up scrapping the whole thing out, shelling it, and rebuilding it from scratch. But eventually I got it working. But my point being is that we're really, there's a lot of human error. We're not experts in what we're doing, and a lot of parts get ordered. And it's not necessarily what's wrong with the piece of equipment. So there's that human error as well as part of the abuse and fraud and waste. And I wouldn't say it's fraud per se. I just say it's inexperience, and it's just a human error element.
Well, you work in corporate America too. How does I mean, people make errors there too. I've seen them. So
right.
how does that compare?
Right. I think in corporate America, and I remember, I think maybe it was Tim Philback I heard it about, is that, when you make a mistake, it's kind of like you don't immediately fire that person. You're like, you know what? This was a learning experience. If I fire this person and I hire someone new, then they're going to make the same mistake and they didn't learn from it yet, like this person is. So this person's already learned, and the hope is they don't make that same mistake again.
Right. Tim made the point that, he always asks them, so what'd you learn? And Tim's going to be back tomorrow, by the way.
Oh,
Yay,
great.
Tim.
Yeah, I like Tim. He's a great guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think the difference being is that in corporate America, we're hired to do a job. So I think you give a little bit more of a concern to your job as well. Whereas in the military, there was no incentive to necessarily learn your job because they can't fire you.
Right. Okay, that too.
Yeah. So I know a lot of people there who, had kind of learned how to fix the easy stuff. But I ended up being the guy that fixed the hard, a lot of the harder stuff.
Well, sure. That's the fun. That's the fun stuff.
I love the challenge of it. I remember one time I had challenged my superior that hey, give me a couple days off if I could build an entire radio out of the scrap box. Supposedly the scrap box was where all the bad parts were. And I remember I was able to put one together that actually worked. He was a little bit surprised by that.
off of parts that were broken.
Supposedly broken.
Yeah, right.
Now part of that's the pop and swap. We had a pop and swap kind of mentality to it, where we didn't, we were trained at the component level, and I tended to try to always figure out the component level. But the easiest thing to do is if transmit's bad, pull out the transmit card, replace the transmit card.
Sure.
So it was very easy to pull a card out and replace a card rather than try to find the exact diode, which usually it was a diode or a resistor or whatever. But going back to the human error element, I remember as a Lance Corporal one time, I was on a training operation supplementing a mess hall. And I recall this because one time, I was just, it was a tough day. I was tired. We're out in the middle of California desert in Mojave. And I'm just asleep. And then out of nowhere, I hear some music blaring, and people are throwing Rice Krispie treats all over the hut. And then I talked to someone. I'm like, what is going on here? Why did I get pelted by a Rice Krispie treat? And apparently, instead of buying $5,000 worth of Rice Krispies, someone accidentally added a zero to the number, and it was $50,000 worth of Rice Krispie treats. As far as I know, that person got repositioned to a different. He was no longer accountable to the financing of that. That was a mistake for sure. But there's some human, there's definitely some human error to it, and we can't remove all the human error, but this is, taxpayer dollars for sure.
Well, it's human error under a leadership that sounds like they're not, paying the price. I mean, and don't get me wrong, I've seen some horrific waste in corporate America, and sometimes I end up going into these businesses to help with that at kind of a technical level. Usually when I'm there, it's going on at multiple levels at once. And you kind of see sometimes when that business is going to be no more. And I mean, that's the thing. And that's actually what I don't like about the Fed pumping in so much money right now is, sometimes businesses need to fail, and that sounds horrible, but it's so that the resources, which includes the people, can be better leveraged, which means somebody who might be in a horrible job that they're not enjoying because they feel like they're never doing anything productive, they end up going and working somewhere else that is productive. But that all starts with that unproductive company going under.
Correct.
Army can't go under, or if it does, it's very, very much bad for all of us.
Right. Because of that, we get a little bit of complacency, though, as you can probably understand.
Right. I've seen that in defense contractors too. Now, some of the smartest people I've ever worked with worked for defense contractors, but when that was the case, they would quite avidly tell me most defense contractors were morons. There's a lot of waste goes on in defense contracting, from what I understand. That's sort of hearsay for me. I never worked for them.
Right. Yeah, I worked along with the contractors. They made a lot more than us doing the same job we did.
Right.
Sometimes passing their job off on to us, in fact, which is part of the reason I ended up getting out too, is just for the simple fact that I could do the same thing for more money.
Right. Now, you and I were talking about something that tied to current events, and it goes back to you talking about what would happen to people in the military if they pulled some of the stuff that we see certain bad actors in law enforcement doing.
Yeah, certainly. It's a very big deal, and we've seen cases of this in the past with the military. Where if it's made public, it's a war crime, and that goes across the news, and the people get hammered the same as the law enforcement do.
Right.
One thing though is that we do have when I was in Afghanistan and during that time, we had very strict ROEs. They had like 8 steps they had to follow before they could even fire into a car that's barreling toward them. And I mean, there's like 6 to 10 seconds before that car gets there.
Right.
But they have to have, all these steps followed through, or they could be questioned at trial about whether or not they gave it an adequate opportunity to these people to say, hey, here's your warning shot. Maybe you're not, full of bombs and you're going to blow up the entire checkpoint you're barreling toward.
Right.
Whereas with, sometimes with law enforcement, and I don't want to, say, because the media sometimes pushes certain narratives out more than others.
Right.
There's a feeling that, law enforcement jumps to the gun, rather immediately.
Right.
With the military, it can be an international incident. It can be a war crime, which is a very serious offense.
Right.
And get hammered as a military member on something like that ends your entire career in life. You don't just move to another precinct and join up again and move on with life. You're done.
Right. But you were because I always thought that, and this goes back to like the Nuremberg Defense. And I always thought that the idea was that at some point you were just this uber brave soldier and you said, I'm not doing this, to hell with orders. But you were educating me last week on the oath of enlistment, and you were kind of there's kind of some provisions for that. It's like you can stand up for what you think is right, and you're justified in that. Could you describe that mechanism? Because I bet a lot of people don't know about that.
Yeah, sure. Now, my understanding, I took the oath of enlistment. Now, there's a different oath for officers. It's sort of checks and balances. Whereas the oath of enlistment requires that we follow the orders of our direct superiors. The oath of officers, as far as I believe, does not. Now, one of the things, and let me see if I have it up. I don't know that I have the oath of enlistment up here. But one thing that we do is we take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to obey the orders of our superior officers. Now, notice I said orders of superior officers. A lot of people recall and sometimes recollect that it was lawful orders, which that actually comes out of the UCMJ, which is part of the end of the enlistment, which says I'll follow, in accordance with the UCMJ. Now, UCMJ Article 90, and I kind of want to read this one off because I think it's important. So the UCMJ Article 90 says, any person subject to this chapter who willfully disobeys a lawful command of that person's superior commissioned officer shall be punished, 1, if the offense is committed in time of war, by death or such other punishment as a court-martial may direct, and 2, if the offense is committed at any other time by such punishment other than death as a court-martial may direct. That's pretty powerful. Because notice, we're now looking at the lawful order,
right?
But problem is, if you get that wrong, you are now subject in time. And let's recall, America's been at war, what, 223, 93% of its existence, it's been at war. So anyone who gets it wrong is now subject to possible death.
Right.
So to make that stand takes a lot of bravery.
Right.
Person, if they think that legitimately this is an unlawful order, and we've seen that before. I believe it was the My massacre is one I brought up before.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can pull that up. Yeah, I think I got it here. But there's several examples, but I remember the one about it is the My Lai massacre, and it says here on the Quantico Marines Mill article that it wasn't the first or the last time a military force would be misused or corrupted. So we know that these things happen. If you have a military with authority and you have it overseas, you will find this misuse and corruption will happen from time to time. And the only check for that is the individuals there. I mean, either the officer themselves has to realize that this is perhaps not constitutional and not lawful, and then if that officer doesn't realize that, now it's up to the individual enlisted military person to decide, hey, against all their other, peers and their superior officer, that this isn't lawful. And in this particular case, one person stood out, and I believe, they ended up being questioned and taken to court-martial, and they were found, they were found it was in their favor. They were found that it was a unlawful order, and they were not particularly charged in that case.
So but you need huevos muy grande, but it's kind of a matter of confidence. I mean, if you know you're right, you have footing to stand on at least.
Right. But at the same time, you're making a very like I said, brave stand, because you're there with your peers, and if your peers don't particularly like you already, and you make that kind of stand, you may just end up a casualty of war. That's something that could happen.
It could happen.
You may not make it to your court-martial even, which we hope that doesn't happen.
James Connolly is offering us something here. I state your full name.
Yeah, that's the oath of enlistment.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, James.
So there's that for you all. So another kind of myth that we were talking about is at least you get good health care, though, right?
If you can use it. They don't tend to like you taking time off from work for anything. There's a thing called and I don't hear this too often elsewhere, but in the military, it's a very common thing to hear the word malingerer. Are you aware of that word? It's someone who fakes or falsifies or overblows an injury.
Oh, got ya.
Yeah, so oftentimes, and I mean, the military's tough.
Do heel spurs fall into that category?
Yeah, I believe some people in power right now may be malingerers.
Known to happen.
And that's an interesting note is that, a lot of we haven't seen a military president since Bill Clinton beat out his election.
Right.
Where before we had a lot of, prior military experience as commander in chief. That hasn't been the case for the past several years.
Right. Well, one of the things that's I've had difficulty with, like I've been at a party before and had a former military guy. He was drunk and I mean, alcohol affects different people different ways. He got to be a crying drunk, and but he was having trouble coping with things he had seen, things he participated in, and that's something I was talking about. Good Lord, I think just last night, the discussion of white phosphorus is, I kind of feel like those of us who stay home should feel guilty and stuff like that too. I mean, we're the ones paying for it. We're the ones allowing it. I mean, just because we're not the ones taking the orders, that doesn't make us any less guilty. I think maybe it makes us more guilty. I wasn't out there protesting, and protesting's essential. All protesting's essential. But I feel like, do you feel like people maybe end up aligning with our party because they know we're against sending people off to war? I mean, surely that's the case, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something to be brought up about the idea that we do things in wartime and understand. I think a lot of veterans understand war is hell. Things are going to happen. You have to expect that there will be collateral deaths on occasion. So war is not something to take lightly. You don't want to just go to war over any small slight.
Right.
But one of the things you see, like when you're talking about the white phosphorus, we're talking about Agent Orange, we're talking about the Gulf War pesticides, is this there's actually an ignorance at the time to these things. We don't know the effects of those things right away. For instance, Agent Orange, at the time, this was, even the military people that were flying over and spraying this all over the vegetation and sometimes their fellow soldiers nearby didn't realize that they were potentially, creating future health issues for those people.
Right.
They understood this is, hey, I'm clearing this jungle so that now my fellow soldiers aren't exposed to all kinds of ambushes and attacks.
Right.
And the same thing, I'm sure with the white phosphorus. I mean, I think people understand to some degree the nature of chemicals and what they can possibly do, but no one saw the potential repercussions of what that would mean if that ended up in the air and atmosphere, people breathed it in, and then down the line that created Gulf War syndrome or any of these other things that we worry about.
Right.
So I think that when you're using government and military and you're using these, and there's often frontline advancements in technology that aren't well tested, but at the time they're considered necessary, right? But we don't know the repercussions of that until further down the line. And then we realize that in the end, was it worth it to use those things if it really hurt the people that supposedly we were helping, our fellows, our soldiers, our servicemen? This was supposed to help them with the cause, and it ended up, creating lifelong health issues for them.
Right, right. And everybody's always quick to talk about, being against a war, or at least they are after the fact. I mean, libertarians are pretty quick to be against it beforehand, but it's not really just that, because a lot of the wars you get into, you're effectively into it before the beginning of the war. I mean, we set ourselves up with this with alliances a lot. Is that something that people in the military are really aware of? Or, I mean, they're pretty young.
Yeah, they're young.
They're
I don't
young.
think that we're aware of it. I think we're aware after the fact, and maybe some of us who really kind of, we were affected by the war, so then we start looking into history of war in America. We start seeing that there's a clear differentiation between 20th century warfare and prior to that, where and we've had a lot of inner turmoil. Let's clear that out. The U.S. has been a war, at war with not only itself but others since its inception. The inner turmoil we see today isn't anything new.
Right.
We've had, wars with the Native Americans here in the beginning. We've had wars with other cultures that were part of, the nation and its immigration. We continue to have wars today internally. But once you look past the 20th century, you'll start to see those entangling alliances. Look at who was sided with who and who they were against, and you'll start to see that instead of one or two people against one or two people elsewhere, it's now, 5 or 6 people against 5 or 6 other people. So the war, all these alliances and all these wars are now becoming much more complex. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at.
Right, right. I like Jacob's comment here. When politicians fail at their job, the military usually cleans up the mess. And I feel like some of that happens because the politicians, I can't quite remember the quote, but it's sort of like military begins where politics ends. But I think they're counting on that. Is, they're trying to use coercion to work things out instead of working things out peacefully. I mean, when I have a client, if we disagree about some terms of the engagement, I don't pull out a freaking gun. I just say, I'm not willing to do it for that. Go away. And that really solves more problems in life than people give it credit for.
Right.
And I think in a lot of people pretend in these international affairs that doesn't really work, but it does work up until the point that the other person's using force. Yes, thank you, James. War begins where diplomacy ends. That's what I was looking for.
And since you bring that up, it's interesting because the last kind of half of my career, I worked in more of a diplomatic setting.
Right.
So at that point, I worked as an 8156 Marine Security Guard, and we were tasked with securing the U.S. embassies, diplomatic security, the diplomatic embassies overseas. And like Jim said, war begins where diplomacy ends. So if we have all of these, 255 some odd, embassies, why are we seeing all this war? Why aren't they, why aren't we focusing more on what we can do diplomatically instead of, like you said, resulting to, the use of guns and warfare?
Right.
I think some of that comes to, we now have a huge media presence. We now have not only that, but the president himself has a huge media presence, and we're not seeing necessarily the information from the diplomats that are in charge of those particular areas or regions. I don't hear anything from the ambassadors to that embassy in Libya, or the ambassador in Germany, or the ambassador in Iraq, or or any of the countries out there, I hear, people here on, on domestic soil, usually the president or the court of public opinion, and it's usually bomb all those people. Who cares about them? They hate us. They hate the West, and that's not always the case. One particular, let me preach on one particular example, and this is something that I think is important. Is that I've had experience living overseas. I've had experience living on compounds, but also living within the communities of different countries. I was in Berlin, Germany. I was in Khartoum, Sudan, and I was in San Salvador, El Salvador. And all of these places, I thought generally the people who live there have the same desires that we all do here in America.
We're all people.
We're all humans. We're all people. We have family. We have loved ones. We're not all, people like to criminalize other people and say, oh, these people are criminals. No, they're just trying to protect their families too, or they're trying to make a better life. I really enjoyed, my time in Sudan because Sudan is actually kind of noted as a place where Osama bin Laden took refuge, and people say, maybe they were involved in terrorism and stuff. The only person I know that was really terrible in Sudan was Omar al-Bashir. That's the president of the country at the time. They've now overthrown him. But the people themselves were some of the nicest and most friendly people I've ever met, and I'm very happy to still be connected to a lot of them.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it was a great time I had there, and I think that was a very eye-opening experience for me because, I imagine if we go to any of these countries out there, I mean, let's even talk about maybe the worst one that we think of is maybe North Korea, and I think a lot of people realize that North Korea is enslaved and they like to say maybe indoctrinated or brainwashed, but I think a lot of them are fear. They're in fear, and they don't want to. They can't speak out on their dear leader, but many of them don't agree with dear leader.
Right.
So the people themselves aren't bad.
Well, back to the idea of the use of force. Something that's really been stressing me out these last few months, like COVID-19. Yeah, I'm not a fan, but it's gonna kill tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds. Well, it has killed hundreds of thousands of people, and that's not a good thing. But it's not the sort of thing that destroys societies. People start talking about the Defense Production Act.
Mm-hmm.
The Defense Production Act scares me because essentially you have, and you could tune into like CNN or CBS or any of those, and you'd have doctors and nurses there talking about using the Defense Production Act. It's like you are talking about forcing people to produce things. And, people sort of saw it the other side a little bit when we started talking about meat manufacturing, because it's like, wait a minute, you're going to make all these sick people go into this plant. Then they started getting it. But, when you're manufacturing things by force, that's where you end up. It would have been much, much better if I'm not one for handouts, but it is effectively a time of war with the virus. So I'll make exceptions for stuff like that. So you want to send the hospitals a bunch of money and say, spend what you need to buy the masks. You offer people enough money to build the masks, they'll make the frickin' masks. They will make them. You point a gun to their head and tell them to make them, they're going to find an excuse. I mean, they might try to make them, but they're going to look for ways to alleviate the pressure. And do you really want to do that anyway? Is that the society you want to be in? You're just enslaving people. Right. And we saw the same thing last week with get off your porch, go inside, shooting. I think it was like just paint gun or paint pellets or something like that. May have been rubber bullets, but it wasn't a regular live fire. But we're forcing people to get off their own front porch and go inside. They weren't posing a risk. They were just sitting on their front porch witnessing what was going on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I find far too many people in our society are far too quick to go to force. And I've never been in the military myself, but my observation is people who have been in a situation where they really learn what force is, they don't turn to force as quickly, not in the same way. Pepper balls, says
Yeah.
James.
And now that you mentioned that, I kind of want to talk about that because that, as far as I know, that happened up in Louisville. I actually called out because I thought at that time that was the National Guard. Now I understand that after talking to someone who's in the National Guard and had information about that, that was actually militarized law enforcement. And one of the things that I've noticed that we're seeing here is that civilians, they can't differentiate law enforcement from the military at this point. Now the military usually wear their battle dress uniform, BDUs is what we call it, and that's the camouflage.
Right.
But they're wearing additionally over top of that now, lots of armor, and the military is wearing lots of armor. So, and they're now using military assets. A lot of law enforcement's using military assets that's been handed over to them, and it's hard for any civilian to tell now the difference between law enforcement and military. And it turns out that in that incident, I saw where people were standing out on their porch, going, look at this, the military, marching through the streets. Then the next thing you know, they're hit with rubber pellets and pepper balls, as Jim Connolly mentioned. In that case, it was law enforcement. But I think the reason I want to bring this point up is that law enforcement's designed for an entirely different purpose than our U.S. military.
Right.
And with that in mind, law enforcement's trained, because these are American citizens that law enforcement deals with every day. It's a much different situation. In some regards, I can see it being more stressful because you should avoid lethal solutions at all costs. The law enforcement's designed to bring people to trial, not to institute justice and execute. Obviously, if they witness a incident where someone's life's in danger, they need to take whatever measure it is to protect that life, even if it's their own. But when it comes to the military, we're not trained necessarily, unless you're in a diplomatic position like I had been at one point. We're trained to respond with overwhelming and subduing force. We're trained to use lethal force as far as necessary, and once the threat is now neutralized, anyone who happens to still be injured but alive or surrendering, we now move to operations where we provide medical assistance. By military law, that's what we're supposed to do, is provide medical assistance and take those prisoners of war.
Right.
It's a much different operation fighting people in warfare, foreigners, than it is, going against American citizens.
Well, it should be.
Yeah, it's designed that way for a reason. And we discredit our military, and we bring, bad reputation to our military when they come in onto American soil and they begin using their tactics to complete the mission as they've been always trained and instinctually trained to complete it. And that's not good. We don't want Americans to dislike our military. That's not what we should have. And obviously, we can look back to Vietnam and see the dissonance that we had between people who were forced to go into the military and the people behind who vehemently opposed the military action entirely. In that case, it's a terrible situation because people had no real choice without repercussions.
Right.
You could resist, but at the same time, you're now liable to go to prison.
So yeah, that's an interesting question. Let's say you take somebody who's kind of a conscientious objector. They want to be, but they're not really quite brave enough to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So they just go in anyway. I mean, the hell kind of soldier does that make? That's not going to work. That's terrible.
Yeah. Foreman, we had some. I'm gonna tell you what. Anyone in the Marine Corps loves their corpsmen. These guys are some of the most brave and badass people you'll ever meet. because their first objective is to not, necessarily fire back and shoot and subdue the enemy, but to run out in lethal fire and pull your butt back out, and even there on the spot, if they have to, provide medical assistance to you. So, and a lot of corpsmen, that's exactly what they do. They run out, they don't think about themselves, they don't think about the fire around them, they think about, how can I save this person's life? So I think some conscientious objectors may go in that route.
Yeah, that would be good.
They do have a sidearm, so they do have something to protect themselves. But.
Cool. Did we have any questions? We've ate quite a bit of time. I suspect Joe could go for another hour or so, but we better not. I'm worried people see the length of these videos and they're like, that's a long time, I'm gonna go do something else. All right, tomorrow we have Tim Philback, as we already mentioned. And you know what? I'm not even 100% sure what Tim and I are talking about. I think we're probably just tackling his platform, the things he's running on. Last time he was on, I just kind of introduced people to Tim. If you've not got to know Tim Philback, go get to know Tim Philback. He's a kind of an experienced blue collar guy, really down to earth, really pragmatic. But just in doing his job, he's definitely developed some leadership knowledge and some leadership habits. He's a really awesome guy, and I feel like he's someone who understands the needs of a lot of people, and I think we should absolutely send him to Frankfurt. And if you don't believe me, join me tomorrow, get to know him a little better, see if I'm not right. You can, of course, always go to perry4ky.com/donate, because not everybody knows to tune into these. And we are in search of people who don't yet realize they're libertarians. And you can help with that by liking, commenting, and sharing, just playing the algorithm a little to get this out there. If you know somebody who's former military that you think maybe would like some of what Joe had to say, if you think that would help, be sure to direct them to it. But in addition to all that, I do use Facebook ads a bit, just to sort of shotgun it out at targeted audiences. So you can help me do that by giving me a little cash, because I basically took the year off to do this stuff. So my income is limited. Do you have anything else for him tonight, Joe?
No, it's been an honor, Rob. And if you ever want me to come back on, I'll be more than happy to.
We're absolutely going to have you come back on. You hear that, guys? What I want you to do is I want you to chime in and let us know what me and Joe should talk about next time. That's all we have for you today. Have a good evening.